Thanks. That was good. Good job. All right. Well, it's great to sit with you today. This is kind of nice. I can't quite see everyone, but hey, that's better for your view.
This event seems a little misleading in that we're about to have a great conversation, and you guys get to listen, which seems a little unfair to you.
Yeah. We usually do this in a podcast studio, and so it's easy to forget that people listen in, and so we end up really just having some good guy time together. I guess we can't really quite forget that you're here now, but...
what Jacob is saying is that he's terrified.
Yeah.
So we're often saying things that people don't like, such as get rid of your 401k, stop investing in the stock market, don't retire, things like that. And because of this, I'd like to give a special thank you to all the babies who came today, because you guys don't have any hang-ups about any of this stuff. You're just starting out. You especially. But in all sincerity, I think babies might be a good place to start, because these Catholics, in my experience, are very good at being obedient to the church when it comes to the activity of child making and rearing. And we do this despite a culture and a world that tells us quite the opposite of what we believe to be true. And while, granted, there's quite a bit of disobedience in the church, it seems like among what you might call conservative Catholics, it's not hard to tell people, look, the world is telling you one thing, the church is telling you the other. Be brave and obey the church, listen to her tradition, despite what the world says. This at least has been our basic experience. But what we've found, and what I've found, is that you cannot quite substitute this with the question of money and get the same results. It seems like within conservative Catholicism these days, there is still a sense that money represents some kind of neutral sphere in which the morality of the church, while it might, say, influence us a little more, maybe we give a little more than the person who doesn't believe, maybe we have better uses of our money than other people, the actual work of saving and of spending and of using money is pretty much considered as a neutral technology that we could orient to any particular end. And our only question is that our only prerogative is that we orient it to good ends. And this seems to have been, in our own lives growing up, the basic dominant sense of what the Catholic has to do with money, right? I mean, that was...
Yeah, I think that's right. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington. My dad was in finance. He worked for Microsoft. He was a partner there. I'll never forget the day when I was 11 years old, and he comes to me with a big stack of papers, and he's like, I'm going to start to teach you how to read public companies' quarterly statements. And, that was kind of ruled and dominated my growing up years. And I eventually converted to Catholicism and was just so happy to be a Catholic. And, but after some time, I found that I could go to Mass every day. I could pray my rosary every day. But really, I was tired of being a Catholic for just an hour a day. And that was when this guy over here, came over to England and said, the thing that you're missing in life is Catholic social teaching. And I thought, wow, that's great. And Catholic social teaching really is this way in which we can live a different pattern and order of life so that we can be holistically Catholic. And one thing that one of the reasons I suspect that the talk of money doesn't really make it to the pulpit all too often is not only that that's kind of our Western world's sacred cow, but really because that fundamentally redefines the way that we interact with people socially. There's a lot that's said about, Catholic moral teaching as it pertains to the family, to sexual ethics, but that is quiet in a certain sense. That can be almost, that's the best way to say that, misunderstood to be a private realm because it often happens behind closed doors and really should. But the ideas of money are out in the public. It is the most public thing perhaps we could do because the very invention of money relies upon a society collectively agreeing to understand this piece of paper to hold that power, that little piece of metal to hold such power. And so when I kind of hit this rut, really in my own life, I thought, well, it's strange that Christ speaks more about money in the Gospels than anything else, and yet I have not really heard too much about it, which is a very different story from what you actually get in the Middle Ages. I think today, so much of our lives are really defined by buying and selling, exchanging and giving and commerce. Whereas in the Middle Ages, life revolved so much more around growing and sharing. But from the pulpits, you heard about money all the time. And so what we're kind of hoping to have a conversation about today is what they talked about. What were not just the principles that govern money, but really the virtues that governed the right use of money.
Right, absolutely. I mean, what is being Christian all about? It's about becoming a saint. It's about becoming someone in particular. And the whole concept of the virtues is just that your actions never float off into the ether. Rather, everything you do contributes to who you are. And at the end of the day, hopefully before we die, what we want to be able to say when we meet the Lord Jesus is that, of course, I was inadequate. Of course, I made mistakes. But I longed to become your servant. I longed to become someone good. The trouble with money is that it often allows us to think that there's certain activities that we can do with it that have nothing to do with who we are becoming. We say, oh, I have this money, I use it for these ends, but the money itself doesn't relate to who I am. Now, in the Middle Ages, this was completely absurd. Now, has anyone ever called you magnificent? Has anyone ever been called magnificent? I have never been called magnificent either. I would appreciate it if anyone would call me magnificent by the end of the talk. I never really had a lot of money. I'm not very good with money. As a concept, it doesn't attract me, and as a reality, it's very rarely been attracted to me. So Jacob and I hope, provide two different backgrounds to give you the confidence that what we're not doing is describing a sort of ideal framework in which we're about to ask you for a bunch of money and you'll feel obliged to get it. Because I've noticed this about our talks is the first 10 minutes, you're all on edge like we're about to ask you for cash and we're just prepping you for it.
No, Jason Craig's going to ask you for
Jason,
later.
That's Jason.
Yeah. We're not even going to ask you for $1.
That's Jason's problem. He can't help himself.
It helps them to give it away.
That's right. So I've never been called magnificent, and what shocked me was that within the Christian tradition, it's not just that the use of money is understood to be a part of your becoming a saint, but it was so understood that there are actually specific words that indicate people who use money so as to do so. A magnificent man, as we'll talk about, is someone that uses great sums in such a way as to become a saint, so that he actually merits in his use of large sums. Now, we don't even have this within our vocabulary, right? Like, there's no one we would call magnificent and mean anything by it besides something like, he's great. Have you noticed
or
this?
Or he got a lot done.
Well, yeah, but have you noticed this with positive words? It's like, as modernity creeps on, they just all start to mean like, I like that. Like, hey, that's awesome, that's great, that's terrific, that's fantastic. It's all the same. And money has slipped into this sort of relativism of language where we just only really seem to have positives and negatives. But what we were finding in the Middle Ages is the idea that there were like thick descriptions of character types because of the use of money. There were liberal men, there were magnificent men, there were beneficent men, and you can note these people in the street and refer to them as such and expect them to do certain kinds of actions and to have certain kinds of habits. And this is why the Middle Ages, often when we look back, we see it as somehow beautifully archetypical, right? Like that they seem to have distinct roles. Well, the way they used money was part of that because they thought money contributes to sanctity the same way anything else does. And so what we want to talk about is just really quickly to lay out some of those virtues. Because we could come here and tell you something like investing in the stock market is 99.9% likely to be a sin. That's one talk we give. But we thought what would be better is to provide you with a sense of what money is positively for, so that when we talk about the different kinds of acts that we believe to be detrimental to the acquiring of virtue in this regard, that it doesn't come out of nowhere, and that most importantly, you don't realize we're doing some kind of like merely moral analysis, as if we're just looking for the things you should be slapped by God for versus the things you should be praised by God for. We want to know how to become saints. And Jesus Christ in the Gospels says this mammon, this money, is for the purpose of what? Anybody remember? Friendship. We're supposed to make friends with money, which is the whole story of the church, is people growing in virtue so that they can be friends with each other unto the whole world. So we're going to talk about the virtues. We have 5 of them. Of course, there are more. Virtue theory, despite what some people might think, does not quite end with Aquinas. I think even he would say there are probably more virtues than are listed in the Summa. But we're going to talk about the ones that we did find there.
Yeah. So just kind of a quick note on even saying what Mark said and just pushing it really far down the road before we get into the specific virtues that we're going to hit. Following God is a lot like driving a car. Most ways it's different, but in some ways it's similar. The way in which it's similar is that you really want to look down the road to see where you're supposed to be driving and keep your eyes that way. What's the major thing that we all learn when we go to the driver's school is that if you look at the median, you're probably going to hit it, right? So what's the analogy here? If you're thinking about the laws, the things that you shouldn't do, and are asking, like, how close can I get it? That's like looking at the median. You're going to hit it. It's like the high school, I like to make the analogy to the high school boy that asks the question, how far can I go with my girlfriend? It's just the wrong question to be asking.
Other high school.
Not Canongate. What these virtues are for, we are going to give the opposing vices just to help us juxtapose what we're not supposed to do with what we are supposed to do. But really, this whole thing is saying, what are the things that we can do to become most virtuous? Growing in virtue is becoming more social. It's what St. Maximus the Confessor says, that having God written on your heart. St. Paul commands us to be clothed with Christ. It's actually becoming more social, more of a friend, able to welcome more people into our life, enter more into their life, all through becoming more intricately connected in God's own life. All right, so that's what these virtues are going to be. We're going to just get into them.
And so, as anyone discussing a virtue should begin, we'll talk about Google. So Google, when they were first starting out, they had a brainstorming session.
Yeah.
About their motto, because you got to have a motto. Several things were kicked around, such as, let's take over the world and make it horrible, but they didn't like that. And eventually somebody, I think the inventor of Gmail, I forget his name, right? Yeah, he came up with a great idea. Don't be evil. Do you guys remember this? This was Google's tagline for a while. Don't be evil. And he said, well, this is because they didn't like what some of their competitors were doing, and it had a funny kind of ring to it. Now, it's not funny. Actually, it's horrible. Don't be evil is the idea that what is required of goodness is simply avoiding evil, right? Now, this is contrary to the idea of beneficence. Beneficence is a virtue in which, the word is very simple. Bene, right, for good, and then some kind of facere, for doing, right? So it's doing good. And it's very important to realize that we can't be like Google in this regard. We should all know this in other aspects of life, that no part of the Christian moral life should be guided simply by the things we cannot do, as if it was sufficient to say, well, I will avoid evil and thereby become a saint. As if the saints were the not evil people of the world, right? It seems to sell them rather short. And what Google found is the moment that you set for yourself a non-beneficent goal, that is to say, the moment that you refuse the habit of doing good as your mission, you actually end up doing the evil that you wouldn't do.
Not Google. What?
Google itself. So whether it's, profiting off of slaves in China or simply selling our information to the cops, whatever it is, the point is that you never come to know the evil just by attempting to avoid it. How do you know evil? Precisely by knowing the good. To avoid evil, we must run after good deeds so that we can know evil in the contrast. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the Thomistic sort of doctrine here, right? That evil is a privation of the good. But one of the things that this implies is that you don't get to be good by avoiding evil. Now, money, I think more than anything, can tempt us away from developing the virtue of beneficence. Why? Because it doesn't have in itself a clear purpose. And so Catholics, Christians, are often tempted to say, well, because it has no clear purpose, then I will simply avoid doing evil with it, and thereby use money well. But in the medieval world, the reason they had the virtue of the beneficent man tied in some sense to his wealth is because it was a virtue that you habituated yourself to always giving gifts, doing good with your money. It meant that any time that you had 20 medieval dollars in your pocket, that your immediate response, your habitual response, was what good to do with it, right? It was never merely to attain it and to hold on to it and to avoid evil. Why? Because it might make us think that we're somehow, by not doing evil, avoiding bad habits. But in fact, we are developing a bad habit. And that's the habit of simply keeping money without a use, right?
Well, yeah, or even going further, it's the vice that opposes the virtue of beneficence. Is actually, does anyone want to take a guess on that? Is that fun? Can we do that since this is a conversation? No, it's not fun. It's scandal, which may be a little bit out of left field. And the reason why this is because beneficence is a proper description of God who, in the Gospels we are taught, likes to give good gifts. And scandal is a vice that teaches something false about who God actually is. So whereas beneficence reveals God the Father's true heart of building up, of creating a world, making a beautiful garden, placing Adam and Eve in it, the scandal is that he creates a world that is scarce, that is hard to live in, that makes work more difficult.
And maybe this could be explained better, because you never are really scandalized by Joe, who you just know. Joe messed up, you don't really feel like, maybe you're frustrated with what he did, and maybe he stole some money or something, and you say, Joe, that's a real shame. But are you scandalized by Joe? Maybe, maybe not. But of course, if the President of America, if someone within a high position of power, a priest, a bishop, is accused of stealing money or some other vice, what happens? Well, then there's an added phenomenon, right? The phenomenon of being scandalized. Why? Well, it's precisely because where there is that great wealth, that great power, that great capacity to give, we know that there is a specific image of the Father in his plenitude, right? A bishop is never just a bishop. A bishop is an image of God. And not simply in the way that everyone's an image of God, but preeminently in his beneficence, in his office, in his standing over others, in his ability to give, in his administration of grace, right? So that when a bishop falls, when a bishop sins, it's not merely Joe's sin, right? It is a scandalous sin, because he is supposed to be an icon, right? We are supposed to look at him and see who God is. And instead, he becomes, in his sin, an idol instead of an icon, which is to say, we look at him and we see a false God, right? Children know this, or rather, parents ought to know this, in their fatherhood and in their motherhood. They know that they are an image of God to their children precisely in their giving of good gifts. And that if they are to become stingy, if they are to become mean, if they are to become overly calculating, they don't merely provide a bad childhood experience that the child can then just grow up and skip over. Rather, they create a certain framework for knowing God that the child has to heal from because they have to learn to know that God is not like their father. And how paradoxical to have to learn that the Father is not like your father, right? But this is the vice of scandal, right? That this image of God is blurred and falsified, and God is presented as something he is not. So when we talk about money, this might seem like we're a little far afield of money, but when you have money, you have the whether you like it or not, the appearance of God to others. Now, you might not think that, because again, within our society, money is described as a neutral tool. You have it or you don't, whatever, it's no big deal. But notice how you are to the poor, for instance, the moment a poor person knows that you have money. Now, granted, our society makes it really difficult for people with money to run into people who are poor, but it happens. And when it happens, who are you to that poor person? Don't be shy. You are God to the poor person. And all of our false humility within liberal modern states would have us say, no, I'm just like him. I just happen to have this money. There's nothing particularly required of me, But no, to the poor person, you have the capacity to give life. To the poor person, you have the capacity to heal, to give, to help. You are an image of God, whether you would or not, precisely for the fact that you have money. But this means that money carries with it an obligation. The mere having it means that if we do not develop the virtue of beneficence, which is to say, if the poor person cannot look at you in your actions, in the way you use money, and say, the Father is like that. You see that? That's who God is. That's someone who gives and gives and gives well, and I can trust them. Right? If that is not people's experience of you and your money, then we are not developing the habit of beneficence. And what we are doing, whether we know it or not, is developing the opposing vice of scandal.
And I would toss into here, and this is where Mark started with this virtue. I thought we were starting with a different one, but we're going right for the heart of America with this virtue. And the reason why is that beginning even with Aristotle and moving forward, is that beneficence was a virtue that was descriptive of a person that not only lent to others, but invested in others as well. This actually gets really clear in the way that John Paul II defines investing. He gives us a really clear definition in paragraph 36 of Centesimus Annus, where he says that to invest is to offer people an opportunity to make a dignified use of their labor. It's a chance to offer your neighbor a chance to dignify his labor. And you see the exact parallel here with God the Father, who again sets Adam in the garden to work and to till it, to giving him a good opportunity to dignify his own labor. That is the point of investing. That's it. That's the goal. And beneficence is the man who fulfills it. Whereas in the opposing side, scandal is the one who hampers work, who makes it more difficult, who does not give people an opportunity to make a dignified use of their labor. So let's put all this back together in a box here of what we've kind of talked about. So if beneficence is an active decision to do good, the opposing mentality is to just avoid evil. Scandal here informs us that avoiding evil actually leads to our failing to give people the ability to dignify their labor. And of course, investing is not meant for everybody in this case. So I think that's clear, is that not everybody is in the privileged financial position to do this. But I'm often reminded of all of the so-called ethical funds that are available today. And they say things like, we don't invest in child labor. We don't invest in slave labor. We don't invest in abortifacients, in contraceptions, in companies that produce them. It's a whole list of don'ts, not any list of do's. I've actually not seen one yet. And I think that's actually an inherent problem of a secondary market, but we actually won't get into that today. You can kind of find that, we can chat about that later. But
Today the stock market will live.
Yeah,
Limp
one more day. But beneficence really is the virtue that teaches how to invest well.
Yeah.
So there you go.
And before we move on to the next virtue here, one of the practical things that everyone can take away from the question of beneficence, and to also help us to see our distance from it. And I hope you don't think that like I come from any kind of position in which I am beneficent and I'm bestowing it upon you. I'm learning to. And one of the things that shocked me in considering was that if money is always supposed to be an image of God, or rather if it's always supposed to make you appear as the Father who gives good gifts, then it means that there's something a little bit worrisome about the habit of having savings accounts. Now you might think, what's more responsible than a saving account? Sure. The problem comes in when we don't deliberately allocate the money we save towards particular gifts and particular ends and uses that we want it to have. And this brings us to liberality. You know, all the virtues are a form of charity, of course, so we can skip from one to the other.
That's right, yeah. Liberality is really the major virtue that pertains to money. It is, as St. Thomas says, the man who knows how to use money really well. If money is just a placeholder for some good, then the liberal man knows always what money is holding a place for. There are two opposing vices to the virtue of liberality, and that is covetousness on the one extreme and prodigality on the other. Neither knows how to use money well. For the prodigal, he gets $1 and just spends it on whatever he's emotionally feeling at the time. He's constantly down and out. He often finds himself living amongst the pigs. That's not pointing at you, Jason, I promise. Yeah. That is the problem of the prodigal. He actually is a type of nihilist where he doesn't really think that there is a real purpose, some reason to save up power to be able to, once it's hit a certain point, expend it and achieve what really needs to happen. He doesn't have a clear purpose in his mind. Well, so too does the covetous man, St. Thomas teaches us. He says that the covetous man is the one who mistakes the purpose of money, which is spending it, for saving it. That's the covetous man. Neither know what money is for. Neither are connected, I think is maybe the most important way of putting it. The person that is most interconnected with his society, with his city, with his friends, to know what are important projects that need to be built, what are the things that I really need to spend on. So of course, I think one thing that should be said here is that this is not a blanket statement against all savings. It is an actual condemnation of general savings, but not of specific savings. If you need to buy a car, if you need to buy a house, but see what's happening there. You recognize money as a placeholder. You know what it's holding a place for, and once you've hit the limit of what you're saved up for, you're able to procure what it is that you want. This is liberality. This is probably one of the things that is most simple, and yet so most alien, perhaps in the way that we think about managing our finances today.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've always found that one of the biggest curses put on Catholics and Christians these days is that we're often cursed to simply wait for things. Now, what I mean to say is, like, when I went to college was always described to me as this preparatory period of waiting. And at the end of college, I was going to take everything I learned in college, and then I was going to go be a Christian. I was going to enact everything I'd learned in philosophy and theology. I was going to enact the kind of power I'd been given. Now, this all sounds well and good until you're a sophomore and you get hit by a bus. And then you have to face Christ and say something to the effect of, well, I was waiting to be a Christian. It was going to happen. It was going to be great. You know, it was really going to make a big splash in the world. Money is something like that, right? Where we don't have the virtue of liberality, which habituates us to the giving of gifts, where we don't have that virtue of liberality where money is transparent to what it's for, so that when we see it, we're never focusing on it as an idol or an abstract power. We don't love it as such, precisely because we look through it and we just see swimming pool for my kids, or whatever. I don't know. That might be a luxury item. But when money becomes transparent to what it's for, the person who has the money is free from it as money. He is living in touch with the real world. What does he want? He can describe what he wants. He wants this food. He wants to have another kid. He wants this land. He wants this house. He wants to give this gift to that person. It has been allocated so that when the time comes where he can give the gift, it's so free. He just gives it. There's no, oh, do I want to spend it on this? Isn't there something out there in the infinity of possibilities that might be a better purchase? No, he's already made the habitual commitment. He's already giving it away. And if you've ever met a liberal man, because I think they're around, they're very fascinating creatures because they'll give you things and they'll have no compunction. They won't sit there fretting about it. They won't even have discussions about it. Sometimes it makes you feel guilty, the fact that they give it to you, as if you should have done something more. But they are not prodigal. Don't mistake them for the prodigal. They have considered you in their heart, and they have considered you as a proper use of their money. And so that when they give it, it's precisely because they have that virtue that enables them to do it. And boy, would that we were all so free with our money, right? Now, what was I was saying something, though. That wasn't the point. Oh, the savings and such, yeah. When we refuse to become liberal, what we end up doing is considering money as an abstract power. And the difficulty with that is this is another form of waiting, right? So just as that college career is a sort of waiting for an eventual Christianity, right? Just as some of you high schoolers might imagine you're being formed for something that's going to come later, it's false precisely because human life is finite. And for the Christian, there is no waiting. There's formation, but it's always formation in action. We are right now supposed to be holy. We are right now supposed to be good. We are right now supposed to be doing the will of God. Money's no different. We are right now supposed to be using it for God, to build his kingdom on earth. We are not supposed to hold. Now that might mean, of course, this is where the caveat comes in. That might mean saving for something that you know God wants you to purchase or give. But there is no acquisition of abstract power that allows you to be justified, as it were, in the owning of the money, or in the having of the money, right? That's where that money becomes idolatrous, when we don't have the liberality to see it as transparent to the goods that it can acquire for us. And so when we talk about something as controversial as not having a general savings account, the idea is quite simple. It's that you should not buy into the modern notion of abstract power, right? This goes rather deep, I think, because I think in modernity, our very notion of God has been scandalously made into our image of the very wealthy man. What I mean is, right now, consider our billionaires, consider our Musks and our Zuckerbergs and all that. They got a lot of money. What's it for? Well, I don't know. It's for whatever they're going to do, I guess. The point is they simply have it as a store of power. They are powerful, and for what end? Who knows? They might surprise us. But we become habituated in our view of wealthy men who are not liberal by any means to view God in the same way. And actually, if you want to get into it, I mean, the modern conception of God hinges on this, where it describes God as having an abstract but unused power, right? God could do anything he wants, and then out of that abstract power, he chooses particular things. So that instead of seeing God as always giving, as always for the good, for our good, we begin to develop a notion closer to that of some versions of Protestantism and certainly that of Islam, where God, thankfully, does things we like, but in his abstract power could do anything at all. And this creates a very perverse view of God. We don't need to go down this theological rabbit hole per se, but it's important, I think, to see the consequences. Once we realize that our having money, our having power over others makes us an image of God, then liberality is important not simply for our own souls, but for our catechesis of our children and of others who look to us to see who God is. Because if for us, if money is always transparent to us and goes straight towards towards the particular goods that we're supposed to give, then we give an image of God who is always committed in his salvific act. And that's important.
Yeah, and I think one of the major dispositions that arise in us when we think about ceasing to be prodigal or covetous and start to think about ourselves as being liberal is fear. So we don't actually trust God to do as he promises, and that he will actually take care of us. That when we look at the lilies, we don't really think of them as being taken care of, or we don't really believe that God's the one doing it. So in the midst of all this kind of consideration of the virtues of money, it is these first virtues of faith, hope, and charity that have to orient and steer the ship, making sure that we actually believe that God is who he has revealed himself to be. I think in relation to liberality and kind of knowing what our money's for, it's connected also with this virtue, or rather the externalization of the virtue of charity, which we call almsgiving, which is another big topic that comes up all the time in the early church, all the time in the medieval church, and actually probably is one of the few things that really does come up today, but I think it's helpful to really zone in on it. Almsgiving is the giving away of all of your superfluous money to the poor. That's what it is. So, of course, that demands that we know what all of our money is for, so that when we get to the superfluous levels of wealth, we know that we should be giving that away.
Right, like you can see, but you can see how this ties in, right? How could you know that your wealth is superfluous if it's an abstract store? Mm-hmm. Right, if it's not committed to particular ends, if it doesn't have an allocation, if it just simply sits for possible emergencies or possible uses, then giving alms is technically impossible. And actually there were arguments, Pascal has a spat with the Jesuits of his day, where apparently they were arguing, I've only read Pascal's side of this, but apparently they were arguing that there's no such thing as having superfluous wealth, because it could all technically be given to your station in life and your family, and you could always potentially do something more with it. And he was saying, well, this is ridiculous. That means there's no almsgiving whatsoever, which seems, on the face of it, wrong, right? Precisely in knowing what something is for, we also know when we have money that isn't for something. And this enables us to do what the church fathers have always said is an act of justice, namely that we give everything that we don't need to the poor. Yeah.
One of the arguments that Pascal claims the Jesuits are making is that people could be taking the excess wealth and increasing their power in society. They could be moving into the better parts of town. They could be getting into a new job. They could be demonstrating some sort of luxury that they have to their neighbors. And Pascal points out the obvious, or at least what was obvious to him, and that falls prey to the sin, the opposing vice of almsgiving, and that is ambition. Now, ambition is one of these other things that we consider, I think, along with pride in our modern American society as a virtue. But for the Christian tradition, it has always been a vice. St. Paul even saying that love is not ambitious. Ambition is the desire to grow in honor, not for the sake of the intention of using your profit for the sake of others, and not for the sake of giving greater honor to God. I really think that that's probably, I don't know. I think that that's a pretty big sin today. It's definitely been something that I have had to continually repent of in my own life. But you
can see how it's connected, though, right? If almsgiving is the giving away of superfluous wealth, then ambition is precisely the use of wealth that you ought to know is superfluous for the advancement of your station, right? For the simple advancement of, precisely when you don't have, you see how the virtues, in developing the virtues, they constantly demand of you that you answer the question, who are you? And this is the hardest question for modern Americans to ask. Because who are we? Well, I would be the king of the world if only my full potentiality would be realized and if I would follow my dreams. That's basically what we're taught, right? Disney says what? You can be who? You can be whoever you want to be. Now this becomes a little bit devastating when you try to be whoever you want to be and they say, oh, sorry, no, you have to pay for that. But we are educated within a culture that basically says that we are capable of any possibility, which sounds freeing until you realize that when you give someone a merely abstract possibility, they become paralyzed. Because out of an infinite number of possibilities, which do you choose? Anyone who has opened up Netflix and said, I'm going to watch a movie, and then tried to decide which of the infinite stream they will choose, knows what I'm talking about, right? There's a problem with this, right? Now, we are given over to ambition for precisely this reason, right? Whereas someone who knows what they are for, and therefore knows what his money's for, and therefore knows what gifts he's supposed to give, and what things he's supposed to save for, he has a limit to his aspirations. And limit's a dirty word in our culture, right? But he can say, I need this and not that. And because I don't need that, then I can give that away. It's a simple life. And it's possible for all of us who become virtuous. But the moment that we have money as an abstract, the moment that we have given over ourselves to the vice of mere acquisition, so I have as much money as I can get, and then I use it on things as they come up, then we are very subtly agreeing with the Disney slogan here, right? Which is that, what things do I need? Well, whatever. What do I need? I need whatever's next. Who am I going to become? I'm going to become whatever's the next level in my advancement towards an infinite possibility here, right? So we become without limits precisely through treating our money as being something that shouldn't have a limit, right? And this just is an obvious plague on the elderly in America, it seems, is that people who do not develop these particular virtues end up at the end of their lives not knowing who they are and spending the last of their lives, which are supposed to be devoted to sanctity in an extreme way because you're facing death now, to finalizing who you are, right? So that when you die, people know precisely who you are, and most importantly, God knows precisely who you are. That these moments in America, these last 20 years or so, are devoted to dissipation and to the purchase of luxury goods and vacations and such. I mean, we know this to be the case. The divorce rates among the elderly are themselves one of the greatest scandals that we face. And why? Well, it's because without these virtues, we are tied to no particular vocation. Rather, in our use of money, we are open to an infinite possibility without resolution. It's a false image of God, and it leads us to acts of ambition and away from acts of almsgiving. Because just like the person who says, well, I've got all this money, so I might as well buy a yacht, you would imagine that they are precisely the person that does not know that your superfluous wealth belongs to the poor by justice. That is to say, it's not an option. It's not a heroic act on your part to say, well, I guess I'll give it to the poor instead of buying the yacht. Rather, your superfluous wealth is for the poor. It's funny because this is one of those things that sounds controversial, but honestly, I can't find anything in the church fathers that's more agreed upon than this particular act. I mean, some of the fathers say things that are very wild, and I have a hard time synthesizing, and I spend a lot of effort, but this one is just, they all say it.
Well, in the Catechism, the 1996 Catechism says that almsgiving is not even a work of charity, that it is first and foremost a work of justice.
Right. And the other thing to consider here is that almsgiving as a habit, where you just get that superfluous wealth out of there every time, is for the forgiveness of sins. And this is what makes it really special for the Christian. That it's not merely, sometimes we can consider habits and virtues in a stoic sense, like we're just trying to make ourselves the best, strongest person, and this is some kind of leveling up situation. But what almsgiving does is it helps us to realize that this giving away of our superfluous wealth is precisely how we also heal the wounds of sin in society, right? Because we stop amassing, we stop fearing, we stop holding things on just for ourselves, and we start healing wounds that are obviously in society. This person's poverty, this person's illness, this person's debt. So we become a source of healing. So you can see precisely how this merits unto our eternal life, right? Because precisely insofar as we heal the effects of sin through almsgiving, we merit the forgiveness of our own sins. Again, this is just the New Testament, right? For the forgiveness of sins, give alms. It's right there, and it continues throughout the Christian tradition. But in America, because we don't have this focus, I shouldn't say America, it's everywhere. Because we don't have this focus, we take almsgiving as identical with giving to nonprofits at the end of the year, right? Which is, first of all, not only is it not almsgiving, but it's barely even giving at all because you get a tax break. I mean, if you're going to do like that, you should at least whip yourself at the same time so you suffer something, right? But we have this idea that even in our giving, we're supposed to gain, right? Which is just hellacious, completely hellacious. Rather, in our giving, it really is a gift. And when we give away our superfluous wealth, we merit eternal treasure in heaven. And the crisis of money, now I'm talking about everything without
Just
you.
keep going, bro. Spitting fire. Yeah.
I mean, don't you think, have you heard, you've heard these things said, right? That money talks, put your money where your mouth is, these ideas that how do you really know what someone's about? Well, you see what they do with their money, right? Follow the money, that's another one of these. I think it's totally true of our society because you can talk all the game you want about how you have these good intentions and how you have this desire for holiness and how you want to build the kingdom of heaven.
Everything I have is the Lord's. Yeah.
Right, yeah. It's all God's. It all came from God. Who am I but a siphon of God, right? But when it comes down to it, the question is, what do we actually do? Do we get rid of the money for the sake of Christ? And if we can honestly say that we do it, right? If we can honestly say that we don't hold back our superfluous wealth, then this merits. And because it's in our society, it is also a sign in the modern age of sincere belief. Because you can talk Christianity all day. The pagans will not believe you until they see you lose money for it. Why? Because money is an idol. It has become a god here. And so you might think that you're obviously, clearly, I know this of myself, like obviously, clearly a sign of Christ's life. But until they see that you're willing to suffer for it, right? Until they see that you're willing to become, at least in respect to money, a martyr for Christ, there isn't this assurance of belief from others, right? Precisely in an age in which money is valued beyond its reality, it requires us to give away our money clearly and intentionally in order to show the sincerity of our belief. It will not simply be done with words, right?
No, I promised our good priest over here that I'd help him raise funds for his church. So let me compare almsgiving to tithing. So whereas almsgiving is the last thing that you do with your money, tithing is the first thing that you do with your money. Almsgiving is the superfluous funds given to the poor. Tithing is the first dollars that you given to the church. And specifically, canon law specifies for the sake of having divine worship. Now, this is really kind of, I think, helpful in some ways. Say that you're down to your last $1,000. You know, you got nothing else, saving the last $100. Every dollar counts, right? You are thinking about the bare necessities at that point. What's the thing that you need most? What's the first thing that you need? You know, what's the main necessity? It's food. What else? Well, yeah, it's divine worship. That's the thing that we need most. We need God most. We need the sacraments most. Before water, before food, before shelter, we need God. That's why we give our money first. All right, that's my shout out to tithing. There you go. But you see, there is this recognition of who we actually are with tithing. Now, the rules and the laws with tithing have actually changed a lot through the centuries. We're at a very loose point. There are very little laws binding us at all, other than the fact that we are responsible for ensuring that our parishes are well funded, that divine worship is taken care of, that access to the sacraments is, at least on our side, provided for. But in centuries past, even finding this in the Council of Trent at the 25th session, that the penalties for not tithing, which at that time was a 10% tithe, was extraordinary. It was even excommunication. You were actually dismissed from communion with the church for failing to give your tithes. No, why was that? So even though that's not binding today, what were the principles animating that can still help us realize what could direct us today? And the answer is actually rather straightforward. It's that if you are being excommunicated for failing to give, then that's hardly a punishment. It is a punishment, so much as it is a description. That you have not demonstrated that you are fully invested in this community, that your identity is bound up in it, that your recognition of your very being is dependent upon this community. There is some sort of ontological recognition of who you are in relation to the church, insofar as you see that you must give so that you can be still united with God Eucharistically. How's that? Want to add anything to that?
It's not bad. It's not bad. So I think we've done all of our virtues besides magnificence, which I started with.
Piety.
Oh, piety. I hadn't thought about piety. Well, let's do magnificence first.
All right, let's do that one.
Magnificence. So the one that I really want to be, but no one gives me enough money. So I can't really be magnificent. One day. So magnificence is simply the good use of large sums. To do things because you have a lot of money. I'm not presuming anyone here has a lot of money. But if you do have a lot of money, then you are capable, in fact, and not just in potential, of becoming magnificent. And it's to give things that no one else can give. It's the virtue by which you use large sums for making changes to your social order, right? The obvious example that people use is something like building a cathedral or founding a monastery or founding a school or something like that, right? So the ability to fund large public works through the use of these funds. Now, what's really interesting is when you look at the Middle Ages, which is an inspiration for us, not because we think it's an ideal time per se, but because it is a time in which people actively sought Christ in a social manner together. And so even when they got things wrong, they seemed to get more things right. And one of the things you noticed in the Middle Ages is that there was an expectation that the wealthy would appear as such, right? So that if you had a lot of money, you would look like you had a lot of money. If you had a lot of money, you would probably have some ginormous jewel here and a hat on your head. And of course, within the kind of propaganda of our own modern rejection of these sorts of things, we have come to see that as ostentatious, right? As merely indicating a desire for showiness and to show off your wealth. But if we even think of that for a moment, we can see that that's probably not true. I mean, look at our millionaires and billionaires today. They are all desperate to appear just like everyone else. They are all very busy hiding themselves within gated communities from the view of other people. They certainly would not assent to having to wear a large hat. That would note and signify to others that these people have lots of money. You see the problem here. Christianity, whenever it sees power, has a very fascinating mode of attack, as it were. It says, let's make that power visible. Let's show the poor where it is. Let's direct the poor to the house of the rich man. Whereas we are so apt to see money as this irrelevant reality that we simply accrue in an abstract way, the medievals were very concerned with it making you a kind of person. And so the rich man appeared rich precisely because it made him visible to the poor who relied on his dispensation, his giving of his wealth. Now, it seems like within our culture, the opposite is the case. And we think of it as a humility, but in fact what it allows is for no demands to be made on wealth, right? Because where the wealthy person is wearing the same shirt and you don't know who he is, you don't know who to ask, you live in a society in which everyone is sort of middling, as it were, then there's no appearance of wealth as being available to being asked, to distribution, as it were. So magnificence is both a virtue, but it is also, like all virtues, a character type. The magnificent man behaves magnificently, right? And it's very important for us because I think we forget this, and we have inklings of it, and we feel drawn to it in certain respects, but our culture means that we tend to draw back from its fullness. I'll give one example. So I do a lot of fundraising around our town in Steubenville, Ohio, because it's a very needy Rust Belt town, and the work of urban revitalization involves a lot of fixing old buildings that have collapsed because after the steel mills closed, we lost a lot of population. And so we basically have more infrastructure than people, which means buildings that are broken. And so I'm often raising money through gimmicks. This is one of the this is one of the horrible parts about a society in which people aren't used to being virtuous with money, is that you have to, as a fundraiser, maybe you guys know this, I'm sure there's some fundraisers here.
Well, you are the gimmick today. You know?
Yeah, hi.
Look at that. Yeah.
As a fundraiser, right, what happens is often this. Whereas in the Middle Ages, if you didn't give alms, I could say, I noticed that you didn't give alms, you must not be wanting to go to heaven, I see. And this would actually be motivational for the rich person to give alms. Or if you could say, look, buddy, you're supposed to be liberal, it's right there in the Gospels, so give me money or go to hell. This doesn't fly well these days. And so what you end up doing is instead of calling on the virtues of the wealthy as someone in need of money, you end up faking the appearance of a business that they can invest in and then get a return. So you say something to the effect of, I want to feed orphans. Okay? I just want to give them food. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a night where you guys come in and you get to bet on like some kind of raffle situation where you're purchasing something that you don't really want, but you need to feel like it's a purchase so that when you do finally give your money, you end up with something that you take home, and having indulged the liturgy of going shopping, you just gave money to the poor. Hooray! Right? Or take something like, yeah, well, this happens a lot. Or, Jacob knows all about this because he's always fundraising. What do people ask for? They ask for their ROI. Who knows what that means? I just learned what that is, a return on investment, right? So you go and you're asking for money purely for a gift, right? And what is the way that our culture says you need to express this to the rich person? As their investment, which they will get a return on. There's a great story from one of our friends who ran an apostolate whose whole purpose was converting people to the faith. He asked the guy for $1 million because the guy had $1 billion, so it wasn't much. And the guy says, well, how many souls are you going to get me?
Well, no, he's asking this like, well, like if I only give you $1 million and you only give me one conversion, then what do you think about that?
It's quite literally a bad conversion rate.
Yeah. But he said, the guy's response, our friend's response was awesome. He said, well, $1 million for an eternal soul? I'd say that's a bargain. But for $1 million, I bet I could get you at least 2.
Yeah. The whole world of fundraising reveals our ontological and spiritual condition, which is that in order to give, in order to utilize the virtues that were otherwise part of our desire to become saints, we must now be tricked into utilizing them through our desires to shop, to gain, and to be successful in investment. It's not hard to see the difficulty America faces through this little tidbit. Okay, magnificence is the virtue that gets us beyond all this. When I was fundraising in Steubenville, we made a bunch of benches, and you could sponsor a bench. And if you sponsored the bench, your name went on the bench, and we used the benches for a festival. So we'd bring them out, make big beer tables, and then spread out the benches for people to sit on. Okay, simple enough. Someone came to me and said, I want to sponsor a bench. More than sponsor a bench, I want to give you more money than the bench is worth because you're doing good work and I appreciate it. So far, so good. And then he said this, don't put my name on it. Now, I thought, gesture of humility. No. Don't put my name on it. Because once people see your name on something that's donated, then they know to ask you for money too. That's what he said. So I said, sure, we won't put your name on it. We put it real big. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying that I want to give, I want certain things from this community. You could see that he wasn't a bad guy. He was trying to do good things. But what was he lacking? The virtue of magnificence, right? That virtue that is willing to appear wealthy in the large use of sums so that when others see you, they know who to ask, right? And this scares us, I think, because more than like being fools with our money or not having enough money, we are scared of entering into a relationship of beneficence towards others, right? To standing out as the rich man, to standing out as an object of petition. Why? Because that is work, friends. That is awkward conversations, right? That is 10,000 sort of opportunities for communion that we'd really rather not have. And I'm not presuming that anyone is in this particular position, but if you're not, then you are in the position to demand magnificence of others. Remember, we're not talking about simply a, what's the word? Like a nice trait that someone has, right? We are talking about a form of charity which is necessary for our salvation, right? So that means that if you have the capacity for magnificence but do not develop the virtue, that you are culpable. You're culpable. And if there's anything in the Gospels that's clear, it's that rich men who don't give are pretty culpable. So there should be an amount of fear in us, too, to not develop these virtues, to not become who God wants us to be.
Yeah. Just kind of as a closing thing, there's this insight that Aristotle had, picked up by St. Thomas Aquinas, later articulated by John Paul II, and that was about how money reforms our thoughts, our thinking. St. Thomas, when he's commenting on St. Paul's line that the love of money is the root of all evil, says it's not the love of money is not the root of all evil in the sense that somebody is loving money for its own sake, like just wanting money to have more money. Rather, it's the ubiquity of money, defaulting all your hopes, all of your actions through the medium of money. That instead of, I think, he puts it later on in a different treatise, he says that money takes the place for where friendship lacks. And so a great way of thinking about this is that if I'm trying to move the piano in my house, I can either call up my friends and have them help me, or I can call a moving company and pay them to help me. In both cases, I am reliant on other people. But in the first case, I am relying on people I know. In the latter, it's people I don't know. In the former case, I'm relying on the currency of charity. In the second, I'm using the charity of the USD. To actually be able to, as St. Thomas then instructs, pivot away from the default mode of using money to the default mode of friendship is starting to embrace all of these virtues, moving towards friendship, which really is our end. John Paul II in Centesimus Annus also talks about how the more systems that we put in place that inhibit our own ability to give the gift of self to others are properly called structures of sin. They are structures that lead us to vice, that lead us to sin, that don't lead us to virtue, that don't lead us to friendship. And so, I guess if we can leave you with anything today, as before we fly back out to our beautiful Rust Belt town of Steubenville, it would be to choose friendship over money in every situation you have. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to close, I'd say the question in all of this, or rather the answer in all of this, is that we use money to make friends, right? So if there is a ultimate purpose for it, if you're ever given it, the question you should have is, how do I make a friend with this, right? What gift do I give? What work do I enable? Ultimately, money is for the sake of building up the kingdom of heaven. And if we are using it in ways that are not virtuous, then inevitably we're calling money to ourselves and not enabling and not making easy the work of building up the kingdom. Now, this is obvious when you could be building a church, but you're not, for instance. But it's present in every single instance of human interaction in which you can build up a friendship through that use of money, or you cannot. Ruben Slife told me that I can't leave a talk with the people of Canongate without mentioning his name, because apparently he's a thing around here, and in his spirit reading you part of a poem. Apparently, this is what he did. Ruben was a great guy, great acquisition for Steubenville. Your loss and our gain. I'm sorry.
Yeah, huge gain for us.
So I'm going to read this to you because I think it's quite beautiful. This abides, that the everlasting house the soul discovers is always another's. We must lose our own ends. We must always live in the habitations of our lovers. My friend's shelter for me, mine for him. This is the way of this world in the day of that other's. Make yourselves friends by means of the riches of iniquity. For the wealth of the self is the health of the self exchanged. Thank you.
Cool. I'm glad you remembered that.
So I'm sure we've gone over, but usually what I prefer with these talks is just to say, hey, you tell me your problems and let me answer them. So if there's any questions, do we have time for that?
Yeah. If you guys have questions for him.
Yeah, we'll just take as many as you want to give, but don't feel like that means that if you want to get up and leave, you can't.
Yeah, first hand in the room.
I just wanted to comment with a quote that Mr. Barron has given, that the poor need us to attend to their needs. We need the poor to stay out of hell.
Yeah.
That's good.
But I have a question. What do you recommend as an approach to people who approach cars at intersections with a sign asking for help?
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? Because we made a lot of anti-begging laws. You might not know of this, but the poor are not merely using the drive-through method for its convenience, but also because when you can't go where people live, you tend to go where people drive. So first thing is, despite how annoying it is, we have to at least forgive them for, making the obvious choice and saying, well, not sure who's wealthy, but I bet the people with cars have more money than me. Obviously, there's always fear of it being some kind of racket, some kind of planned thing. And so if there's a prudential reason to really believe that that people are being dishonest in asking for things, then of course do what my mom always did, which is say, hey, what restaurant can I take you to? What can I buy you? What can I do for you? The worry about being scammed for the Christian should be the opportunity not for less communion but more. Because if there is someone who is trying to scam you, then it means they have two needs, not just the money, but salvation and freedom from sin. So as difficult as it is, and as I'm sure that there are other prudential considerations, such as your car is so full of car seats that it wouldn't work, we should take it as the opportunity to give other gifts, to learn more about the person. If they are scamming us, to find out why and what we can pray for them. It's very difficult. I know we'd all rather ignore it. I agree. But I don't think we can avoid that obligation of at least trying to figure it out. I think the thing we must avoid most of all is the presumption that everyone is a scammer, right? Because once we enter into that, there's just no end to our posing prudence as, or posing stinginess as prudence, right? So love believes all things, right? This doesn't mean that love's naive. This doesn't mean that love's stupid. But it means that the heart on fire with charity believes what's good first, right? Presumes it in the other precisely because you love the other, right? And then is open to disappointment, is willing to risk disappointment. And some of that involves just being open to, it's funny because it's actually some ways a lot easier to give people money and then not have to think about their other needs, right? And so I think if the poor in your town, especially those at intersections, come to know the Catholics as the annoying people that are always saying, hop in, let me take you somewhere, then that would probably be a gain for the church. But in the absence of any other considerations, I think you should give money. I really do. Yes, sir.
What
Oh.
would the medievals kind of say about what is superfluous wealth? I mean, like, I think, like, if we had someone who had like a $5 million house and
Yeah.
$10 million in the bank, we'd be like, that person has superfluous wealth. But like for a middle class person who has a $300,000 or $400,000 house and some money in some 401ks, is that superfluous or not?
Well, if it's in 401ks, it's by definition superfluous,
Yeah.
right? Because you only give the money that you don't need
Yeah.
to it in order to make more money.
Yeah.
Do you have it?
Please. No, I think that's the
but there's one other thing I'd like to say, which is this. Your question is very good, because to understand superfluousness presupposes an understanding of vocation. You cannot know what money you don't need until you know what you need, right? And so what this requires is an examination of conscience. Namely, what do I really need? And what we have in our world is not just this kind of falsity in terms of money, but a falsity in terms of our vocation, that we're always supposed to be open. We're always supposed to be open to moving somewhere else. We're always supposed to be open for a better job. We're always supposed to be open for a new arrangement. I mean, the culture of divorce is basically a symptom of this, right? That even in marriage, there's nothing that locks us into being a particular kind of person. But that even in saying I do to someone, we have an asterisk, read below, maybe I don't, right? So to avoid this as Catholics, it's not sufficient just to make some kind of arbitrary extrinsic decision about marriage. Well, this I'm committing to and I'll never be anyone different. But in terms of my use of money, well, I'm going to leave that open to any possibility. So it seems to me like a budget, as ordinary as that might sound, is probably the first place to start. And if you find yourself budgeting and saying, well, these needs are don't support the life. Okay, let's make this really simple. Actually, Thomas Aquinas asked this question and answered it in one sentence. He said, how much money can a person have? He said, as much as is necessary for the duties of his office. So all you need to do is figure out the duties of your office and how much they cost. And then you've got your answer. The difficulty, obviously, is that we seem to imagine that we have no office. That if we have a purpose, it's momentary and fleeting, and we could do something else at any point in time. So a lot of this virtue is only going to be acquired if we do something prior to all of it, which is commit to life. To say, yeah, I live here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm buying a gravestone. Yeah, I married her, and if there's more kids, all right. So I hope that helps. I mean, in the end, it's never a decision that someone else can tell you, right? Because I can never tell you what's superfluous for you, right? But I can say an examination of conscience and a list of the duties of your office would go a long way. And then what you'll find is as you're making the list, you're going to notice a bunch of luxury items. Luxury is a sin we didn't talk about. But luxury is real basic. It's just the sin of thinking you need something when you don't. And when we find that, we can scratch that off our list and it becomes superfluous wealth. Boom. We just gained in a certain way. Anybody else? You had a question, yeah.
My question is pretty much the same as his. And your answer was good because a lot depends on what is our purpose with the rest of our life. Are we prepared to approach with God, or are we going to go off and live all these vacations that cost a lot of money? There's decisions that we have to make. And then a lot of it is, what does it cost to bury me, and what does it cost to pay doctors, and how much do I get to pay doctors? Do I want the government to have to pay doctors? No, I want to do that myself.
Sure.
Hospital. So there's so much we don't know. To me, it's hard to plan for what we really need. So, but you gave me a clue, and it has to do with how we're going to use our time that we have left.
Yeah.
And how we're going to use that to build a kingdom. And so we try to figure that out and then
That's right. Yeah. And one of the things that we should notice is that it's a work of corporal work of mercy. I'm pretty sure corporal to bury the dead, right? And so some of our we always have to be careful because some of our worries about savings, it does involve our death, right? But there's this missing part of our Christian communities is that actually it's requisite upon young people to bury the dead, and we instead imagine that it's always requisite upon the person at the end of his own life to bury himself, which I don't know if you've ever tried it being dead. The shovel gets heavy for some reason, right? So there's a lot of things, and we can't go into all of them right here, and so I feel the pain of a lack of detail in this kind of talk. But almost inevitably, whenever you're sitting there worrying about some kind of saving that you must make because you're going to be a burden on someone else if you don't make this saving now, very often you're touching some point in which our social order is no longer Christian, right? So if you're worried like, oh, well, I can't have my children take care of me when I'm old because they have their own lives and they need to get out of this town and be great somewhere else, probably right there you're touching a point at which our social order is no longer Christian, right? But which has valued things like money and success over things like the family, right? Like we live in a world in which parents, I frankly find it sad, but they plan for the end of their lives to be lonely and for their children not to take care of them, and that's actually considered a virtue. And I can see why. Like there's this sense that you're crippling your children by being a burden on them, right? But is this the spirit of the gospel? I mean, it doesn't seem like it. It seems like young people need to become willing to take in their parents, and parents need to become willing to live with their children at the end of their life, which is not always possible, but it seems like within every society, up until the invention of retirement funds about 40 years ago, sorry, giving them too much, that this was part of becoming a virtuous person, was the expectation of taking care of the dead, of burying the dead, of the burden of each other, bearing it, I should be clear, for each other. This was an expectation of human life. And we live in a weird society in which we're kind of excused from these basic acts of charity, and so we have less to do, which is a real shame. We have less to do to become saints. We have to kind of imagine some kind of creative idea, like, well, I'm going to go off to Calcutta and sort of figure something out there to become a saint. It's like, well, if we would live normal lives outside of funds, outside of sort of securing things by the use of investment in the market and such, then we would have these opportunities for sanctification present right in the very natural order that God has given us in the family, and dying and getting old and getting sick and raising children. I mean, this should be part of it, right?
I was taking notes, and you mentioned that you were going to give us 5 virtues, but I only took 4.
Yeah, so we got beneficence,
Yes.
liberality. Almsgiving is a manifestation external of charity. You have magnificence. What did I say? Magnificence? No, I didn't say magnificence. Yeah.
And that's it.
And then, piety is technically that last one.
Okay.
When you're choosing friendship over.
Oh, okay. You mentioned friendship.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
And the opposing vice to piety is simony.
Simony.
Yeah, simony. So the selling of holy things. So you can see how this relates, I hope.
All right.
Yeah.
One more question. All right, we got one more question, or no more questions?
No, we're cutting you off.
All right.
No, sit down. I'm here. Adam called and said, "Do you think you can maybe speak on behalf of the board of Kennegate at the end?" I realized, he just wanted to make sure that they ended. I was excited.
He knew us.
I've known Jacob separately. I've known Mark separately. And we said this on the podcast, but what they don't know, I've never listened to a podcast. So I've never seen them together in the same room. So I don't know who Bert and Ernie are, but I know that they're working together. It's great. So we do want to bring this thing to an end so that we can make sure we're prepared for the liturgy. That does not mean you have to leave. And in fact, the one thing we don't want to happen, I was thinking about, we keep talking about money. And I recall in the gospel when our Lord brought up to the rich young ruler, he started talking about money and then he went away sad. We don't want that to happen here. And I do mean wholeheartedly and seriously that the easiest way to not sin with money is to give it away. And I am on behalf of the board of directors of Candygate. It is something I believe in, and people ask why your kids are too young. I actually live too far away for them. One is my friendship with Cedric, that I know him to be a man that I trust and to lead the school, and that I know that the virtues of grit and integrity in him, every time I'm with him, it's challenging to me, so there's a good person at the helm. And I know that the school is for the people that I know and that I love, and I was walking up, I saw a daughter of a friend, and I said, how's your milk cow? And we have interacting lives. Molly is her name, apparently she's not doing well. She got out and cut her ear this morning. That this is, Candygate is not just tossing your money out to goodness, but it's where you live. So it's the first place that you ought to consider investing. So there's a good ROI where you live, somebody to bury you. But in all seriousness, I do want to invite everyone here, if you have not decided yet on what the purpose of your money is after this very challenging talk, I'm here to help you. It's Candygate. Oh, look, the cards are being passed out. Right there, how convenient. I do want to thank our guests, and I think we can continue with the questions. Yes? Okay.
Do we have to go to the airport?
Yeah, a couple more.
Okay, cool.
Wait, I'm sorry, the guests, you got paid to be here. How much are you giving? Just
One more thing.
Did we get paid?
Regarding
No, we didn't
you
get paid.
get paid.
No.
They did not get paid. What are you doing? You're so cheap. Thank you.
So an anonymous donor contacted me today to say that he's willing to match up to $10,000 given by the Candygate community. Okay, so you can add that to your charitable and heartfelt love for Candygate today. So thank you. Any other questions?
I took the notes. Another question. If you have to give me a simple response on why I shouldn't save for retirement, how if you could explain to me. I mean, to what you were saying.
Yeah.
Haven't heard your talks or anything.
Sure.
Pretty new to this, so I didn't know where I was going.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty open to be a saint. I do want to be a saint.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Please help me out.
Yeah, I'll kind of give a prefatory answer, and then maybe Mark can hit it home. Ted Bennett was the guy that discovered how to use the 401k, which was in 1980 that he did this. And today he regrets the fact that he popularized this technique. He regrets it for a number of reasons, but one of the most poignant that he says is that he was once asked, what did people do for retirement before this? And he shot back at the interviewer and said, you know what, the family is not today what it once was. Nobody really considered retirement in the same way that they do now. They don't prepare for it in the same way they do now because the unit of the family was the center of all care. Pretty profound words from an accountant, I gotta say. Sorry if anybody's an accountant, but pretty profound words. I think that is part of the discovery. When Our Lady forewarns us at Fatima that the family is going to be, seen through the scope, this is one of the ways in which it was attacked, is that we're finding our transient nature, our savings, as an alternative to the choice over love. I'll say one last thing as well. So this is all like, choose your kids, live with your kids instead. That's our simple answer. My kids are my retirement account. Is that when we come into this world as babies, we need to be taken care of. We won't survive on our own. At the end of our life, we are finding ourselves in an auspiciously familiar situation again, where we have to be taken care of once more. In the middle, it's our job to take care of people on the extremes. That's our goal right now in the middle, to take care of those younger than us, to take care of those older than us. And you are always going to be but in those extremes, we're always going to be taken care of by someone. It's either going to be someone that we know or someone that we don't know, that we just pay to take care of us. And part of the great privilege of helping your family members die is something that we would never. I lost my dad 10 years ago. I lost my godfather 2 years ago. To lose a family member and to be there with him, helping him to die, is just something that you don't want to rob your kids of as well. So I can say that having gone through it.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say is just to make a distinction that there are goods that you as a parent of children can right now pursue in order to make it easier for your children to take you in, right? And above and beyond, it's simply catechesis at first, right? We have a friend who almost as a dinner time routine says, hey, you guys know I have no money. If I die, it's on you. Or if I get sick, it's on you. You got to take me in. His kids are like, yes, Dad, we know. But he has like 10 kids, so hopefully one of them will, it'll hit the mark. Right? But so it's not to say that you simply imprudently cast yourself upon your children, right? Like maybe that means while you can, working on building an in-law suite with your house. Maybe it means saving for another car. Maybe it means, I don't know. For me, when we take in my mother-in-law, it meant her husband giving us money that he had worked hard to earn to build a wheelchair ramp so that she could easily come into our house, etc. So it's not to simply say like make no provisions, but it's to say the provisions that you make are as a family, where you no longer presume that it's some kind of wicked burden to ask for care at the end of your life. This requires great humility because we are educated within a culture of independence, and we believe that at the end of all things we should be the most independent, right? We're the most free, we're the least burdensome, right? But in fact, I think if you look at our society, the opposite is the case, that what you really find within elderly communities and communities of the dying is people who really miss their kids and who do not even necessarily have the language to explain their sorrow, which is that their family is apart and this was supposed to be a good. That they were supposed to be able to do this with money, and they're doing it with money, and they have visiting nurses or whatever it is, and it's all taken care of, and and they're lonely. And so while it can feel like a charitable gift to our children now to say things like, and I've heard this, my parents have changed in this regard, but like I've heard this before, parents saying to children, oh, just put me in a home, like when they're young, and saying things like this. And that is a kind of catechesis. That's an inculcation in a way of life. If you say that to your children now, they will do it. I mean, it's barring some kind of conversion. They're going to obey you, right? And if you tell them things like, I don't want to be a burden on you, and you go out there, get out of this town and do your own thing. And, we do this by rote, but its effects are real and they're not good. So right now, starting to develop new habits of saying things to our children like how good it is that we are together, how glad I am that you're here, how helpful you are to me. I hope that you stay, right? You never want to be smothering about it, right? Like, so I get there's dependence within independence, right? Which obviously we can't go all the way into now, but I think we should be very realistic about the world we're living in. It's not a happy retirement world. So.
I think you need us to stop. Okay. Thanks, everybody.